You're listening ad-free on Wondery Plus.
One day in 2009, a high school janitor was mopping the hallway in between classes when he heard a heavy scraping sound. The janitor looked up and he saw a student slowly walking towards him. The boy's grotesquely swollen right leg dragged along the floor, and he walked with a dramatic limp. The janitor smiled and waved at the boy as he approached. After all, this boy was a familiar sight. It took him so long to get between classes, he would have to leave 10 minutes early just to make it to his next one barely on time. And so the janitor saw him going through this routine all the time. Just then, the bell rang, and more students streamed into the hallway. They jostled past the limping student, knocking him off balance, as a few kids snickered at the boy. For 3 years, the janitor had seen this happen every single day. He wanted to yell at the kids to stop being bullies, but he knew that would only make things worse. So instead, he gave the young man a reassuring pat on the back as he hobbled by, and the janitor just hoped that whatever was wrong with this boy would clear up soon. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mrballen, and this is Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please replace the follow button's air filter with a whole, uncooked salmon. This episode is called Adrian's Leg. 12-year-old Adrian Martinez smiled as he pedaled his bike through his dusty neighborhood in Socorro, Texas, on a hot September day in 2005. School was scheduled to open for the fall the next morning, but Adrian was free as a bird today as he cruised the streets of this small city on the Mexican border. If Adrian was being honest, he was pretty excited to start 8th grade. He was a good student with lots of friends, and he loved playing sports after school. Besides, much as he loved summer vacation, the long, hot days could actually get pretty boring. Adrian was already thinking about what he was going to wear for the first day of school. As Adrian rounded the corner onto a street, he waved to a group of boys playing basketball in their driveway, and he also stopped to pet a neighbor's dog. Adrian had always lived in Socorro, Texas, and he felt like he knew almost everybody there. This truly was his home. Adrian skidded to a stop outside of his family's modest home, where he lived with his mother, whose name was Maricela, and his 3 siblings. Adrian was the oldest boy, and his father was not in the picture, so he and his mother were very, very close. And in a way, Adrian sort of felt like he was the man of the house. Adrian knew that his mother was having a really hard time right now. She didn't have a job, and so supporting him and his siblings was really hard. But at least she didn't have to worry about Adrian. He did his best to make sure of that. Adrian laid his bike down in the front yard and ran to the house, taking the steps to the front door 2 at a time. The next morning, Adrian woke up full of excitement and rushed to the bathroom. He'd woken up early to make sure he could claim the shower before his siblings could come out and create a bathroom traffic jam. But when he was toweling off, Adrian began to notice this weird burning sensation in his right leg. As he looked at his leg more closely, he realized the pain was coming from the pink birthmark that ran from his ankle all the way up to his hip. Adrian had always had this mark, but it had never hurt before, so he just kind of shrugged it off and wrapped the towel around his waist and then wandered out to the kitchen to tell his mother. But when his mother kneeled down and gently pressed her palm against her son's leg, she quickly pulled her hand away and looked up at Adrian with concern. His leg felt weirdly hot, as though only this part of his body was running a fever. Adrian's mother stood up and told her son they would get his leg checked out after school. For now, she just rushed him to his room to go change. He'd be late to class if he didn't hurry. That day, after school, Adrian sat on the edge of a doctor's exam table, swinging his legs back and forth. He felt the cold metal of the stethoscope on his chest as his pediatrician, Dr. Andrews, listened to his heart. Adrian shifted in his seat as Dr. Andrews wrapped an itchy cuff around his upper arm to take his blood pressure. Maricela gave her son a sharp look and reminded him to sit still. Then Dr. Andrews told Adrian to lay back on the table and roll up his right pant leg. The physician gently touched the birthmark, and immediately Adrian squirmed. It didn't exactly hurt when the doctor touched him, but it was uncomfortable. Dr. Andrews would confirm that Adrian's leg was still warm, but besides that, it didn't seem like anything was physically wrong with him. He told Adrian and his mother that this was likely just growing pains, because Adrian was starting to go through puberty. The doctor said it was not uncommon for boys to have these mysterious aches and pains as they grew into men. 4 months later, Adrian was out in the street throwing a football back and forth with his buddy Sam, when as he went to go catch the ball, he suddenly realized he couldn't run very well. His right leg suddenly felt heavy, like it was stuck in mud. Adrian had been playing football with his friends every Saturday since seeing Dr. Andrews, and up until today, everything with his right leg had been totally fine. His birthmark on his leg still did burn a bit, but it wasn't too bad. So Adrian told Sam that he had to go home now because of his leg, but he'd see them next weekend. Then he slowly made the short walk down the street back to his house. And once he got home, he went up to his room and he took off his pants, and when he looked in the mirror, he was totally startled at what he saw. His right leg looked significantly bigger than his left leg. For a second, Adrian was terrified, but then he remembered that his doctor, Dr. Andrews, a few months earlier had said this was no big deal and he had nothing to worry about. And so despite what he was seeing in the mirror, Adrian told himself he was just fine, and then he walked away from the mirror, trying hard to forget what he had just seen. A few weeks later, in February of 2006, Adrian hopped on his bike and began riding to school like he did most mornings. But this time, something just felt wrong. As Adrian pedaled down the street, he felt his right leg bump up against the frame of the bike. He also realized that his jeans on his right leg felt unbelievably tight. Adrian slowed to a stop and looked down at his legs. And immediately he could tell through his jeans that his right leg had ballooned in size overnight. He'd never seen it this swollen. But again, Adrian told himself that his doctor said it was fine, so he pushed the thought away and tried to pedal his bike again. But now it was impossible because of how swollen his leg was. Every time he tried to turn the pedal, his right leg really pushed hard against the frame, and it really hurt. Adrian didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't go to school like this. So he stepped off his bike, turned around, and began pushing it along next to him towards his house. And as he walked home, the pain in his right leg was so extreme, he had to fight hard to keep tears back. A couple of weeks later, Adrian sat next to his mother in the doctor's office with his right leg extended out in front of him. It was now so big, it was hard for Adrian to even bend his knee. They were waiting for his latest round of test results. Socorro, Texas was a small city that didn't have that many doctors, but Adrian felt like he'd seen every one of them in the last few weeks. They'd run every test they could think of. Adrian had multiple x-rays, MRIs, and CAT scans done. The doctors hadn't told Adrian or Maricela what exactly they were looking for, but so far, they hadn't found anything. Adrian hoped this new doctor would have some sort of answer for him. All he wanted was for his leg to go back to normal so he could play football again and ride his bike again. Just then, Adrian heard the door handle rattle, and Adrian's latest doctor walked into the room, carrying several pieces of paper. The doctor looked down at the papers, then spoke to Adrian and his mother. On the positive side, the doctor said that Adrian did not have heart disease, kidney failure, or a host of other very serious conditions. But the doctor said he had to admit that he didn't know why Adrian's leg was swollen, and so he didn't know how to make it stop. So the doctor ultimately advised Adrian and his mother to just kind of leave the leg alone and let it heal on its own. Adrian couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been watching his leg grow bigger and bigger for almost 6 months, making it nearly impossible for him to do more and more everyday things. Why couldn't the doctors figure out what was wrong? A few months later, Adrian was sitting in class when the bell sounded to signal the end of the period. Students sprang out of their seats, rushing out of the classroom, but Adrian just sat there and waited for the crowd to thin. Then, when they were all gone, he braced his hands on the desk and pushed himself up to stand with a grunt. As soon as he began to walk, he felt a shooting pain in his right ankle, and he nearly fell over into a table. It had been months since Adrian had seen that doctor that said, just wait this out, but clearly his leg was not getting better. It was just getting worse. By the spring of 2006, his right leg was nearly double the size of his left leg. It looked like the leg belonged to a totally different body. Adrian had started wearing these really baggy jeans in an attempt to hide his right leg, but all his classmates knew, and they were not shy about teasing him. As Adrian limped out of the classroom, he felt the students in the hallway shift their gaze to his leg. Some pointed at him and whispered or giggled as Adrian's cheeks burned red, but right now, Adrian's biggest problem was not embarrassment. It was the pain in his ankle. The sheer weight of his right leg was now so enormous, it felt like his foot was going to collapse with every step. Adrian gritted his teeth and kept his head down as he walked past all the students who were laughing at him, and he made his way to the nurse's office. Once he was there, he asked to make a phone call, and when he called his mother, he did his best to keep his voice steady as he told her she needed to come pick him up right now. About an hour later, Maricela stood in the emergency room, anxiously watching as a flurry of doctors and nurses surrounded her son. She stayed by Adrian's side as he was put in a wheelchair and rushed him from one exam room to another. Once again, the doctors took x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs. They measured the diameter of his right leg and compared it to the information Maricela had given them about how much it had grown. They listened intently as Adrian explained all of his symptoms. Maricela thought this actually seemed different from all their other doctors' visits. Like finally now, these doctors were taking Adrian's issues really seriously. Maricela hoped this was the turning point that Adrian had been waiting for, and that the medical team would finally be able to figure out what this was and then help her son. After spending much of the day at the hospital, Maricela brought the car around to the front entrance to pick up her son. A nurse wheeled Adrian outside, and Maricela helped him out of the wheelchair and into the passenger seat. She squeezed Adrian's hand as they pulled out of the driveway. They'd be back here in 3 weeks for the test results. For now, all they could do was hope for the best. After a long 3 weeks, Maricela and Adrian were back at the hospital to go over Adrian's test results. Maricela sat next to her son in the exam room, her hands clammy as they waited for the doctor. Maricela could also feel the anxiety radiating off of Adrian as he quickly flipped through a book, no doubt just trying to distract himself. Finally, the door opened and the doctor strolled in. He sat down in the chair opposite from the mother and son, and he glanced down at his clipboard before turning his gaze to Adrian. In a calm tone, he told Adrian that the good news was that they did have a diagnosis and it was not life-threatening. These last few weeks, Maricela hadn't dared speak the words out loud to Adrian, but secretly, she worried her son had cancer or some other deadly disease. So to hear this was not life-threatening was just such a relief. But Maricela's sense of relief lasted only about a second, because the doctor then told Adrian that he had something called elephantiasis, which is a rare disorder that causes the lower half of the body to thicken and swell. He explained that when someone has elephantiasis, the natural fluids that surround all the tissues in our bodies get blocked and begin to build up. And in Adrian's case, it was affecting his right leg, causing it to swell and become huge. Maricela turned to her son and asked if he was okay, but instead of answering her, he just looked at the doctor and asked if they could fix it. The doctor took his glasses off, set them down on his knee, and with a solemn look on his face, he told Adrian, unfortunately, there was no cure for this. If they'd caught it when Adrian was younger, they could have given him medicine that might have stopped his leg from swelling, but now there was no way to reverse it. Adrian's leg would never go back to its normal size, and the only thing he could do was wear compression stockings to reduce the discomfort. Maricela watched as her son's lip began to quiver, and then tears began to well up in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around her son and began to smooth his hair back. The doctor excused himself to give Maricela and Adrian some privacy. He said he was so sorry he couldn't be more helpful. After the doctor was gone, Adrian looked up at his mother and he told her that he wasn't sure if he could keep going to school with his leg looking like this. He was going to get bullied constantly. Maricela was thinking the same thing, but she told him it would be okay, they'd find a way to make school more comfortable for him. She said she would do whatever she could to support him. Adrian leaned on his mother's shoulder as they slowly made their way out of the hospital towards their car. Then they drove in silence all the way home. Three years later, Adrian slowly limped into class, mouthing the word "sorry" to his teacher, Mr. Perez. Adrian was used to arriving late for pretty much everything by now thanks to his leg, which only continued to grow. Now, as a junior in high school, his leg was nearly triple the diameter of a normal man's thigh, and it weighed about 150 pounds all by itself. Adrian's leg was so big, he couldn't even fit it in a normal wheelchair anymore. Teachers let Adrian leave his class 10 minutes early to give him extra time, but he was still almost always late to his next class. Some teachers got annoyed, but Mr. Perez didn't mind. Adrian hobbled to the back of the class, wincing as he took his seat. He was still a good student, making great grades and participating in class, but that was partly because, by this point, schoolwork was pretty much the only thing Adrian could do. He couldn't play sports, and he didn't hang out with his friends anymore, and he barely left the house except to go to class. And now, Adrian had yet another problem. Seemingly overnight, a swath of itchy pimples had sprung up on his leg. And so he wriggled in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, when suddenly he felt something burst on his right leg. Adrian looked down in horror as he saw a wet stain begin to seep through the fabric of his jeans. And then an awful smell wafted up to his nose. One of Adrian's new pimples had burst, and it smelled disgusting, like rotten eggs, but even worse. Adrian carefully glanced around the classroom, seeing if anybody else had noticed yet. Mr. Perez stood up in front, writing math equations on the whiteboard. Most of the other kids were copying down notes, but the students right in front of Adrian, so near the back of the classroom, they began swiveling their heads around to face Adrian while wrinkling their noses. As the smell fanned out towards the front of the room, more and more students began to notice. They started looking around, pinching their noses with their fingers, and muttering about not being able to breathe. Adrian stared down at his desk, unbelievably mortified, not daring to make eye contact with anyone. Every time Adrian thought he could not be more humiliated by his leg, there was always a new low, and this was it. It was bad enough that everybody made fun of him because of how big his leg was, but now his leg smelled bad too. Adrian hung his head in shame and began counting the seconds until he'd be able to leave school and go back home. Later that week, Adrian struggled out of his jeans in an exam room at a dermatologist's office. As he did, Adrian scrunched up his nose in disgust because, without his pants sort of masking the smell, the odor from his right leg now overpowered the room. Adrian wrapped a disposable gown around his waist and then sat down in the exam chair. After a few minutes, Adrian heard a knock at the door, and the doctor entered the room. He gave Adrian a big smile, and he asked what brought him in today. Adrian tried to match the doctor's upbeat energy, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. Instead, he started talking about the itchy pimples on his leg. After Adrian finished explaining, the doctor said, "Okay, let me see your leg." And so Adrian slowly reached down and pulled aside his gown, revealing his swollen, pimple-covered leg. And it was obvious the doctor was really caught off guard by what he was seeing. But after the initial shock wore off, the doctor kind of composed himself, and then told Adrian and Maricela that he'd never seen such a big leg before. Adrian immediately looked over at his mother and stifled a groan. He was looking for help from this doctor, not to be treated like some science experiment or circus act. Finally, the doctor slipped on some latex gloves and leaned in for a closer look. And after a few minutes of poking and prodding, the doctor explained that these were not pimples on Adrian's legs, but instead they were pus-filled blisters. And unfortunately, he didn't know what was causing them. Then he reminded Adrian to make sure he was taking regular showers to keep his leg clean. Adrian suddenly wished the reclining chair he was on would just swallow him whole, so he didn't have to sit here while the dermatologist lectured him about taking showers. Usually, the doctor's office was the only place Adrian did not feel self-conscious about his leg. But thanks to this dermatologist, even that was no longer true. A few days later, Adrian was back at school, sitting in Mr. Perez's class. Mr. Perez could see that Adrian looked absolutely miserable. He knew Adrian's leg must be impacting his quality of life, but the teacher didn't know much about Adrian's situation beyond what he observed in class. The teacher wasn't one to get involved in his students' personal lives, but something in Mr. Perez told him this was an unusual situation where maybe he could make a difference. So instead of letting Adrian leave his class early like usual, Mr. Perez actually asked him to stick around after the bell rang. And then once the bell rang and the other students had left the room, Mr. Perez made his way to the back of the class where Adrian was sitting nervously waiting for him. Mr. Perez quickly reassured Adrian that he was not in trouble. He explained that he noticed Adrian looked really upset and wanted to make sure he was okay. For a few moments, Adrian sat in silence, looking down at the desk, and when he looked up, Mr. Perez could see his eyes were full of emotion. Before long, Adrian told Mr. Perez the whole terrible story of how his leg had grown more and more deformed for years, and no doctor seemed able to do anything to help. It was like Adrian had been waiting for someone to ask him what was wrong, and now the floodgates were open. Later that week, Mr. Perez sat next to Adrian in the school library, scouring the internet for information on elephantiasis. Adrian had explained his diagnosis and how there was no cure, but Mr. Perez figured there had to be something they could do. The pair had been meeting in the library during their lunch periods to use the school computers to see if maybe the doctors had missed something. As Mr. Perez read through another medical article, Adrian, who was right next to him, began laughing at a video of a dog riding a skateboard. Ever since they'd started coming to the library, Adrian had seemed happier. Mr. Perez suspected that Adrian hadn't had a friend for a long time. Mr. Perez turned back to his computer, where he had a tab open to elephantiasis symptoms. He read through the list in a hushed voice, verifying each one with Adrian, and as Mr. Perez read on, they realized something strange. Adrian had some of the symptoms of elephantiasis, but other symptoms, such as persistent coughing and chills, were way off. And so a strange thought crossed Mr. Perez's mind. Maybe Adrian did not have elephantiasis. Maybe he had something else entirely. Later that night, Mr. Perez was home, working at his desktop computer. He couldn't stop thinking about the discovery he and Adrian had made at lunch. So he created a new document in Microsoft Word and started typing out all the other types of diseases that could cause a person's leg to swell up as much as Adrian's had. One by one, he compared the list of symptoms for each disease to the symptoms Adrian experienced. And when they didn't match up, Mr. Perez would cross the potential diagnosis off his list and keep on going. After several hours, Mr. Perez was bleary-eyed but determined, and his list was shrinking. He took a sip of coffee, and then he clicked on a disease that he had never heard of before. As he read through the symptoms, his heart began to race. He couldn't believe it. This condition sounded like a perfect fit to what was going on with Adrian. Now he just needed to find an expert that could help. The reality was, Socorro, Texas was a small community without many medical resources. So Mr. Perez knew they would not be able to get Adrian the specialized care he needed here. So Mr. Perez searched the web for experts in this disease he had identified all over the country. And after digging through hospital directories and online forums, he came across a doctor in New York who might be able to help. 2 weeks later, Dr. Robert Rosen sat down in his oversized desk chair after a long day of surgeries and patient consultations in his busy New York office. He surveyed the stacks of letters and paperwork that littered his desk, and he sighed. He doubted he'd make it home in time for dinner. He leaned forward and began rifling through the documents when he noticed a large manila envelope peeking out from under a cluster of papers. Dr. Rosen pulled out the parcel, surprised by how heavy it was. The return address was in Texas. Curious, the doctor ripped open the seal and spread the contents out in front of him. His eyes grew wide as he took in the slew of medical records and test results. Then he saw the photograph of Adrian Martinez and nearly fell out of his chair. In his 30 years as an endovascular surgeon, Dr. Rosen had only seen a handful of cases like this one, and none were this severe. The photo showed Adrian sitting on a couch with his right leg extended. The boy's leg took up practically the entire sofa. It was full of folds and crevices and absolutely massive. There was a letter from Adrian's mother explaining that her son desperately needed help. The doctors in Texas had diagnosed Adrian with elephantiasis, but it just didn't seem right. Her son wasn't getting any better, and now she worried for his life. Dr. Rosen looked back over the medical records, and sure enough, he saw that Adrian had been diagnosed with elephantiasis. But just as Adrian's mother and Mr. Perez had suspected, that diagnosis was definitely wrong. Dr. Rosen grabbed the photograph again and studied the pink mark that now covered the bulk of Adrian's right leg. That was it, the doctor thought to himself. That birthmark was the key. A few days later, Adrian huddled with his mother at the kitchen table, anxiously waiting for their phone to ring. They were expecting a call from Dr. Rosen any minute to discuss what was really wrong with Adrian's leg. When the phone finally rang, Maricela jumped to answer it, putting the phone on speaker and placing the phone on the table in front of her and Adrian. Dr. Rosen introduced himself, and Adrian immediately began to relax. He'd been waiting for this moment for years. Whatever happened next, at least Adrian would get some answers. Dr. Rosen started by telling Adrian that he did not have elephantiasis. He never did. Instead, Adrian had a very rare condition called Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, or KTS. The same disease Mr. Perez had suspected from his internet research. He explained that KTS is something you're born with, and what it does is it causes the blood vessels in someone's arm or leg to warp and twist, which makes it hard for blood and other fluids to be distributed properly throughout that limb. In Adrian's case, the blood and fluid had pooled in his right leg, causing intense swelling. And it started happening when he hit puberty because sometimes hormonal changes act as the trigger for KTS. Dr. Rosen said that KTS can be hard to diagnose because it is so uncommon, affecting just 1 out of every 100,000 people. But there's usually a telltale sign that's visible from birth, a pinkish-purple birthmark on one leg, just like the one Adrian had. With time, the birthmark can thicken and develop painful blisters, another one of Adrian's symptoms, and those blisters were actually Dr. Rosen's main concern, because those blisters were full of infected bodily fluids, which is why the pus that poured out of them smelled so bad. Dr. Rosen paused for a moment before continuing. He said that the infection can spread very quickly throughout the body, and in some cases it can cause high blood pressure or even a stroke and organ damage. Dr. Rosen warned that Adrian's condition was actually so serious that there was a chance the KTS could actually kill him, and unfortunately there was no cure. Adrian's heart raced as Dr. Rosen told him that he now had an almost impossible decision that he would have to make. He said that Adrian could continue to just live with his KTS, risking his life daily, or he could undergo a surgery that he would only have a 50% chance of surviving. In October of 2009, Adrian was wheeled into surgery. Adrian had weighed the pros and cons out, and as terrifying as it was, he knew his only chance at a happy, normal life was to risk the operation, which was a very complicated leg amputation. The procedure took 12 hours, but Adrian did survive, and the surgery was a success. Once Adrian recovered, he returned to school in a wheelchair. He was 150 pounds lighter, and it felt like he was floating through the halls. He finished out his junior year with straight A's and spent the summer adjusting to his new life. And without his leg holding him back, Adrian blossomed in other ways too. He grew more confident and he rebuilt the social life that he'd lost. And Adrian was so grateful to the adults who didn't give up on him. And he and Mr. Perez stayed really good friends. He went on to attend the University of Texas at El Paso, and in 2019, he graduated with 2 degrees in computer science and business. 42, Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter, Julie, and Julie's longtime friend, Silvina Peloso, who was 16 years old, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. After a quick 1-hour-long flight, they landed in San Francisco and then got their bags from baggage claim and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. After Carol signed some rental agreement paperwork with the person at the front desk, they were given car keys, and then the 3 women walked out of the airport into the parking lot where they saw their car. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After the women had put their luggage in the trunk, they all climbed inside, and then Carol began driving east towards the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Julie was competing in a cheerleading competition the following day at that university, and Julie was considering going to the school after she graduated high school, and so this cheerleading competition was a great excuse for her and her mom to check out the campus, and since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, she just tagged along for the trip. After an hour-and-a-half long drive, the trio arrived in Stockton, California, and they checked into a hotel, and then the next day, which was the 13th, Julie competed in this cheerleading competition, and then afterwards, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day checking out the campus and the surrounding town. Early the next morning, which was the 14th, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge that was located just outside of Yosemite National Park's western entrance. Their plan was to spend a couple of days sightseeing inside of Yosemite before heading back to the San Francisco airport, where they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jens, and then the 4 of them would continue their journey and fly to Arizona, where they would explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka, California. So midday on the 14th, these 3 women arrive at the Cedar Lodge, and the lot would have been nearly empty because it was the wintertime and not that many people were visiting the park at that time. So they pull into the lot, they park their car, they go into the front desk where they checked in and they got their keys, and then they left the office and walked along the row of first floor rooms all the way to the very corner of the building to room 509, which was their room. Carol used her key, she opened the door, they went inside and dropped their luggage, and then they decided that they were just too tired to actually go in the park and go sightseeing that day, so instead they kind of had a low-key afternoon and evening mostly in their hotel room. The next morning, which was the 15th, the women got up early, they hopped in their red rental car, and they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite. They went inside, they parked their car, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains and these huge sequoia trees and these beautiful meadows that stretched out in front of them. And then towards the end of the day, Julie and Silvina actually went ice skating on a frozen pond. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. There, they ate dinner at the lodge's 1950s style diner. They ate hamburgers, and then afterwards they swung by the front desk and rented some VHS movie tapes that they brought back to their room. Once they were inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies, and then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter's friend. And he's looking at his watch and he knows they don't have that much time before their flight is going to take off. And he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona and hopes his family will be there. But when he touches down in Arizona, his family is not there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, "Hey, has my wife Carol contacted you?" And they said, "No, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And so Jens is obviously very upset. He's very worried, and he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them, and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. Carol is an unbelievably fierce woman. She's incredibly competent. She will take care of those girls, and I'm sure I will see them tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning and Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or reached out to him in any way, and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyways. She would not have had to go by the front desk on the way out. So that was not an anomaly. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant and nothing seemed amiss. It was relatively clean, minus some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk as they should be. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car, and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. Based on the information the police gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, they began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car and gotten lost, perhaps inside of Yosemite National Park or some other trail somewhere, or they had fallen victim to some crime. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. A number of workers from Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police and subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Also, a number of friends and family of the three women were also interviewed by police and cleared as well. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. Some high school students saw it on the ground and gave it to a police officer. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And so if that was the case, then almost certainly these three women had fallen victim to some sort of crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued to search the roads and trails in and around Cedar Lodge and the western entrance to Yosemite, and they looked all over Modesto. But besides this wallet being found, there were no further developments with the case. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto, California, when he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down. And as he's walking down this road, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. The police come out and they're able to identify this car. This shell of a car is the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. When they searched the car, the inside, the main cabin of the car, there really was nothing left. There looked to be some remnants of some suitcases and maybe some clothing, but mostly it was just the frame of the car and some springs. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Sylvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old. She was not in the car, around the car, or in the surrounding areas. And so there was this glimmer of hope that maybe if law enforcement acts fast enough, they can find Julie and save her before it's too late. But all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search around the car, when they still hadn't found anything, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. And on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the car was. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake. They went up to the overlook as marked on this map, and there they looked down and they saw the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California, that they believed were connected in some way to what happened to these three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Lorwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer and for several drug charges and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. And so when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began panicking about a killer or killers on the loose, the police came out and said, everybody calm down, we have the people responsible, we just can't tell you who they are yet, you need to be patient, we're building the case, but everybody's safe, there's nothing to worry about. But 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders, but they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic, and he had just gotten back to his cabin, which was inside of Yosemite, when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person? And Dr. Kidd said, sure, I'd love to help. And then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one. And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so Dr. Kidd is really confused what he meant about these implications, because in the past 3 years he had worked at this park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people in the park, but they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always because the person got lost or fell or something, which was fairly common inside of the park. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, what's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with regards to this missing person? And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and they were found murdered outside of Yosemite. And while the police have said they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are or charged anyone in their murders. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide that knows everything about the park. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff that were going to be a part of the search sped around the corner and went down this unmarked road with huge trees on either side, and then eventually they came out of this heavily forested road and they entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end across this huge meadow is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy went across this meadow and got closer to this cabin, Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd and his vehicle came to a stop right outside of the marked off area, they got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground, and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers kind of huddled up with the park rangers, and the rangers explained that Joey's friends that were living in San Francisco were expecting Joey to arrive at their house the day before, but when she didn't and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called it in, and that's why they were there looking for her. And so after talking about the circumstances of the case, they all decided they would break into 5 different search groups, and they would begin searching the immediate area. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there, and perhaps the person who was running was Joey. And so they began following these tracks that go right alongside this creek, and then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" And about 10 feet ahead of them, where the ground kind of sloped down into a ditch out of view, right before the ditch, hanging on a little tree on the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd, who was at the front of his small search party, he began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. The other 4 searchers, they walked up and they had a look down, and they too had a similar reaction. And before long, the group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joey's mother was immediately concerned and confused and tried to get more information from this officer, but the officer just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." And so eventually she thanked him, she shut the door, and she went into the kitchen and she dials this number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" So Joey's mother says, "No, I was not aware of that." And then this person very delicately says, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair. Can you make sure it's really her?" And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? That seems like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. She was told to just kind of wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to actually get out there and see what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. And so she has this very restless night's sleep where she's just praying that this person was not actually her daughter. And then the next morning she gets up, she rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. It's because this body did not have a head. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away under some brush, and they were able to confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide, and right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joey's murder is connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Silvina from 4 months earlier, even though the police were still saying, "We have our killers behind bars for those murders. Joey's murder is completely unconnected." Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right about this, because there was a break in Joey's case almost immediately. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout. And as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite. It was pulled off the side of this highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle, but then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight that people like to swim and fish in. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. So they make their way down, and sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves, and this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself, and he takes the marijuana out of his mouth and he says, "Hey, what can I do for you guys?" And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it and said, okay, they confiscated his marijuana, and then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators that had been called in for this case, they analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Kerry's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, but also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso, the friend of Julie Sund. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many people who lived in that area and like some people in the media had speculated. Kerry would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession of how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Silvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Kerry was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Kerry, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Kerry walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters, who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, "Who's that guy out there?" And she would say, "Oh, I hired someone to take care of our property. So he's going to be cutting the grass and, doing some things with our garden. He's going to be here for a little bit, but he'll stay outside." And so this totally screwed up Kerry's plan because he was not expecting there to be anybody there that night. And so for several hours, Kerry anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave so he could kill these 3 people. But the worker was just taking a lot of time, and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. And so finally, Kerry left without any explanation. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the 2nd floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carrie had this urge to find out who owned that car. And maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned that car, and she was potentially alone. And if that was the case, he could fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. And so Carrie parked his car a little bit away from this red car, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this red car. And it was room 509, and he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. And so Carrie stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom and nobody coming into the room but these 3 women and no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. And so when Carrie finally turned around and left to go back to his room, he made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, which was February 15th, Carrie secretly followed the 3 women when they hopped in their rental and drove to Yosemite. He followed them to the parking lot, and then he waited in the parking lot until the women had finished going through the park and having this wonderful time. He trailed them from the parking lot back to the Cedar Lodge, and then he secretly followed them when they went to that diner and they had hamburgers for dinner. And he continued to follow them from a distance and watched them rent movies from the front desk. And he followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside their room and he watched them long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his room and he got his toolbox. In his toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. And then around 11 p.m., he left his apartment and went downstairs and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. And he looked in the window and it was totally dark inside, so he assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack, leaving that chain link lock still attached. And so she looked through at Carrie and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And Carrie, who held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that said he was the Cedar Lodge handyman, he said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. So can I come in and just have a quick look, and then I'll be out of here?" And Carol apparently was just not buying it, and she said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one, but even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow, because we're all trying to sleep." But Carrie was very persistent, and Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming, and eventually he talked his way into the room. And so he walks inside, he walks past the bed where the other 2 teen girls are still sleeping, he goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point, Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol, and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not going to hurt you, this is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed their best chance at getting out of this situation was just to comply and do what he says. He'll rob us and then he'll leave and we'll be okay. And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room, and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend, and before long Carrie had tied up all 3 of them. He put the 2 teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed, and then he proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room, he went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed where he assaulted her before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope. And then after Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. And while she was in there wondering what's going to happen to her, what happened to her mom, what happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and he moved all of their luggage out of their room and put it into the rental car. And then after he was satisfied, he went back inside the motel room, he opened up the bathroom door, he pulled Julie out and had her stand right outside the bathroom, and then Carrie proceeded to clean up the bathroom but left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women women had left in a bit of a hurry. And so after that, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down in the front seat. She only had a blanket on at this point. Everything else had been taken off of her. And then Carrie hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. And the man that had just assaulted her for hours is now driving her into the darkness. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal what's happening to this poor girl. And so for 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night, and the whole time he's trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she's going to be okay and that her mom and her friend, they're going to be okay. And then finally he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. And then once he parks the car, there's no other cars around. It's still dark out. The sun hasn't come up. He gets out and he tells Julie to get out of the car. But Julie is so scared, she can't move. So she can't even get out of the car. And so Carrie gets out. He walks around to her side. He opens the door and he scoops her up like you might hold a baby. And he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and he laid it down, and then he proceeded to assault her again. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. And so Carrie stops what he's doing. He stands up, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet. And so she's standing with her back to the lake. And as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you." And then he pulls out his knife and begins hacking her throat. And then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. Carrie grabbed the blanket on the ground and he walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was nobody out there, so he hopped inside. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, California, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of the road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to police that had the map of where Julie's body was and that horrible message of "we had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. And that was because, one, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing violence against these 3 women. And two, probably most importantly, the police discovered when Carrie was a child, his younger brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. And although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carrie. And so the police figured there's no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knows how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carrie seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save these 3 women from being abducted or from being harmed. In July of that year, so 4 months after the 3 women's bodies were discovered, Carrie, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, he was just driving around Yosemite kind of reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out this fantasy and not get punished for it, when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove his 1979 International Scout blue SUV down this forested road, and he reaches this meadow and he looks across this meadow, and now that this woman is even closer, he can tell she's clearly loading things into her truck, and she's going back and forth, and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin is very secluded, and he's thinking if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. And so after a while, when he only sees her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck and he gets out and he introduces himself. And the woman is so completely caught off guard by this random strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly, that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she says, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" And Carrie would proceed to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. And then at some point, Carrie drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And so Joey put her hands up and she went inside the cabin like she was told, and Carrie followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carrie got in the driver's seat and he began leaving the cabin, headed back out away towards that road he came in on. And as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carrie jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carrie ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carrie off of her, and Carrie, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carrie just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. And the whole time Joey's doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just can't. And finally they get inside the woods and Carrie drags her into this ditch, and once she's down at the bottom, he puts his foot on the top of her head and forces it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And then at that point, he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut. Afterwards, Carrie considered keeping Joey's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carrie attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as is, he left her cabin as is. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carrie would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her two young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Carrie Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. The police would develop the pictures on this camera in hopes there would be some clue as to who murdered them, but it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Carrie confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Carrie Stainer was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken by Julie of her mother sitting on the bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they're getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Carrie knocked on their door. So that's going to do it, guys.